first like to say what an honor it is to have been invited to deliver the 20th annual J.P. Knight Memorial Lecture sponsored by the Center for Women's Development and the Department of Sociology here at Delhi University. I'm especially grateful to Mary John, whose work I followed for many years. I've had the privilege of teaching in the History of Consciousness department at the University of Santa Cruz, as you just heard, for the last 20 years or so. And you should know that Mary John continues to be somewhat of a legendary figure in that program. I'd also like to thank S. Anand and Navayan Press for publishing 2 of my books and for helping in organizing this visit that coincides with the publication of those books. I have looked forward to this trip to India for many years. It is indeed my very first trip to this country. And I can't believe that it has taken me so many decades to visit India. I feel as if I've been trying to get here since the 1970s. But before I evoke that era, let me say that my visit here thus far has been very interesting in a way that I could have never predicted. I didn't know very much about the sport of cricket. But I feel as if the last few days have forced me to pay attention to cricket in a way that I never had before. I got to experience a little of the euphoria over about India's victory over Sri Lanka. And I can still remember some of the headlines: India rules the world, a billion dreams come true. If I had known that these slogans were about cricket, I would have thought that the reference was to some earth-shaking political change. But of course, this made me think about C.L.R. James's remarkable work on the politics of cricket beyond the boundary. Since this is my first visit to India, and I've heard that there were many people here who were involved in the campaign back in the early 1970s around the demand for my freedom. And I knew at the time when I was in jail that there were people in India demonstrating on my behalf. So let me take this opportunity to express my gratitude to all of those who are still with us and those who have passed on. All of those who participated in that global campaign for my freedom so many decades ago. And of course, to me, it doesn't feel like it was that long ago. But I suppose I need to be attentive both to older generations, and I see a few people in the audience who might have been around at that time. But and also speaking to younger generations, when I say that the primary reason I'm here to address you this afternoon is because of that vast global solidarity campaign that was organized on my behalf in the early 1970s. Had it not been for that campaign and its many participants, including here in India and of course here in Delhi, I would no doubt be spending my days in one of the 2 largest women's prisons in the world, both of which are located in a very small town in California across the street from each other. I visited one of those prisons a couple of months ago and was overwhelmed by memories of the campaign, and imagine what my life might have been like had I been convicted, even though the charges of murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy were fraudulent charges. Even though many decades have passed since that era, I want to thank all of those who participated in campaigns to free political prisoners during that period, and would like to emphasize the fact that much work, scholarly work, activist work related to prison abolition has been enabled by those struggles to free political prisoners. And of course, in the US, there continue to be people held behind bars for political reasons. You may be familiar with the cases of Mumia Abu-Jamal, for example, who faces the death penalty. You may be familiar with the case of Lilith Peltier, a Native American political prisoner associated with the Wounded Knee campaign during that era, who is still in prison. At their most productive, political prisoner campaigns help to consolidate global solidarity movements. So I want to acknowledge political prisoners here in India, and especially Binay Singh, who, as you know, was convicted of sedition. I want to acknowledge his wife, Alina Sen, who's in the audience somewhere. There she is, right there. And I had a very moving meeting with her this morning, and I think it is important for us, wherever we are, all over the world, to join the campaign for his freedom, and specifically now for the suspension of the sentence, the life sentence, and for bail. I hope everyone here, at least at the very minimum, signs a petition on his behalf. And I understand that there's an online petition circulating, am I right? And you should know that there are 3 days of events scheduled. It just so happened that those events around his case are happening today, tomorrow, and what is today? Monday, Wednesday. So thank you very much, Alina. Thank you for your work. On behalf of your husband, on behalf of all of those who believe in justice here in India, and on behalf of all of us who believe in justice all over the world. Thank you very much. Thank you. The topic of my lecture this afternoon is prison abolition and the challenges of feminism. Although, as far as I have been able to determine, there's not a great deal of debate around the issue of prison abolition. But I understand that the question of the possible abolition of the death penalty is a major issue here. And I want to begin by saying that those two modes of abolition are very much linked. And as a matter of fact, you know that the death penalty, capital punishment, remains a routine form of punishment in the US. And so as we attempt to organize this campaign to dismantle the prison system and what we call the prison industrial complex, the campaign against capital punishment is central there. I suppose I should say, as I begin, that my own argument, and which reflects those who have been active in this campaign, both as scholars, as activists, as cultural producers, our argument for a world without prisons is linked very specifically to historical developments in the United States, especially its history of slavery and racism. But I hope that you can draw some implications for your own work and I can tell you that I've already learned a great deal in the few days that I've been here that makes me think somewhat differently about the situation in the U.S., especially during the era of Barack Obama. And perhaps during the question and answer period, there'll be time to say something about what it means during this period, during this era of global capitalism and neoliberalism, to have an African-American president who claims kinship with those who have been historically oppressed in the U.S. What we often call 21st century abolitionism in the U.S. entails an engagement with the historical failure to abolish slavery and the structures and ideologies of colonization directed towards indigenous people. If slavery was not entirely abolished, because this is a very central part of the argument, that slavery was not entirely abolished in the 19th century. And the vestiges of slavery, which is what the civil rights movement, or what we call the civil rights movement, attempted to address. I should point out, and I'll probably speak a little bit about this tomorrow, what we know as the civil rights movement was known by its participants at the time as the freedom movement, something that was actually much more capacious than the struggle for civil rights within a legal framework. But that movement addressed the vestiges of slavery, that 20th century movement. So now, how can we imagine a 21st century abolitionism that specifically targets the death penalty and the prison, but more importantly is focused on eradicating the structural racism and on building the institutions necessary to make these forms of punishment no longer necessary? Now, just a few words about the more recent history of abolition, or prison abolition. I would say that after the Attica Rebellion, this was a rebellion in a major prison in upstate New York that took place in 1971. As a matter of fact, it took place while I myself was in jail, and just shortly after George Jackson was assassinated in San Quentin. This rebellion emphasized the need to move beyond the notion of prison reform, to think seriously about the possibility of alternatives to imprisonment. The idea of moving beyond incarceration as punishment began during that period to be taken very seriously in academic circles, in legal circles, and activist circles. Recently, Michael Tonry, who's a prominent legal scholar, referred to the fact that since the 1940s, there have been many in the U.S. who have been convinced that the prison has outlived its historical viability and must give way to something different. In the 1960s, historian Norval Mars, who's written major works on the history of the prison, he wrote, and I'm quoting, "The prison's origins were makeshift, its operation is unsatisfactory, and its future lacks promise. He confidently predicted that before the end of the 20th century, the prison as we know it would become extinct." Now, Tonry concludes that what actually happened was that the prison received a new lease on life. And it's sort of similar to the situation of slavery, which after the invention of the cotton gin, redeveloped at a time when everyone was convinced that it was becoming historically obsolete. Tonry concludes that because of new technological and pharmaceutical possibilities of controlling the impulses of lawbreakers, it's a kind of science fiction projection of no more prisons, but using drugs, for example, psychotropic drugs, to control the impulses of people who are deemed criminal, perhaps even only those who are criminalized, or those who are expected to participate in criminal acts. And so he argues that prison would be a more humane alternative than psychotropic drugs, that they would violate the autonomy of free human beings far more than imprisonment. Now, Tonry implicitly concludes that if the prison as the dominant mode of punishment is ever to be abolished, it will be as a consequence of its own internal contradictions. However, it seems to me that Tonry reenacts the 200-year-old drama to which Foucault turned our attention of proposing the prison as the only solution to problems that have never managed to be solved. Indeed, they have been consistently exacerbated by the prison. The prison as a solution to the problems produced by the prison. Better prisons, which usually means bigger prisons, have always produced more crises, the solution to which are yet better prisons, bigger and better prisons, which produce more crises. So I would like to suggest that to pose such questions as, what is responsible for the phenomenal resistance of carceral punishment? Why has the institution of the prison managed to attach itself to the very idea of democracy? Indeed, the prison is the underside of democracy. It is possible as punishment primarily in societies where individual rights and liberties are recognized, because the prison, the punishment associated with the prison consists in the denial or divestment of those rights and liberties. You have civil rights in the so-called free world. You have civil death in the prison. To continue with a few questions, to what extent is imprisonment a racialization process, at least in countries like the US, like Australia, many countries in Europe? A racialization process that insinuates racial, gender, and sexual inequality into the heart of liberal or neoliberal democracy. To pose these questions is also to interrogate the prospects for a viable 21st century abolition campaign. Now, there are pretty stark contrasts between the US and India. While the population of India is vastly larger, I think the projections are that the population of India will outstrip China in the next few decades, right? While that is the case, the prison populations don't reflect the population at large. In the US, there are almost 2.5 million people behind bars, and I think in India it's more like 300,000, am I correct? For those who are familiar with the situation. The most striking factor about the US prison population is that it consists disproportionately of people of color. And I'm speaking of Black people, Latinos, Native Americans, and increasingly Southeast Asians. Moreover, this mass-scale imprisonment has proved to be so profitable that we now have private prisons. Private prisons and private prisons headquartered in the U.S. running private prisons, owning and operating private prisons inside the U.S., but also all over the world. So the private prison has become a part of the globalization of capital. Now, it's not only the privatization of the institution itself, it's the thoroughgoing corporatization of punishment. Corporations now vie for contracts with public prisons from collect telephone calls that could be extremely profitable, to outsource health care, to outsource meal services, and contracts for all of the various commodities that prisoners are capable of purchasing while they're behind bars. So we see that the political economy of prisons in the U.S. has become so enmeshed in the larger capitalist economy that we can now speak about a prison industrial complex using the same logic that is behind the notion of a military industrial complex. Of course, now everybody's talking about different kinds of industrial complexes. There's the medical industrial complex. There's even the academic industrial complex. But I'm focusing on the prison for now. And I can say that more prisons, more prisoners equals more profits for the architectural firms that design the prisons, for the construction companies, for the private medical companies that ostensibly provide health care for prisoners, more profits for the companies that provide services, food, uniforms, soap, telephone calls, etc., etc. And so prisons not only sequester human beings and devour the resources that ought to be used for education, housing, health, but they act as a haven for backward ideologies as well. Racism has especially found a refuge in prisons, both in the U.S. and in other parts of the world. The U.S. Bureau of Justice Statistics concluded that a black man born in 2001 has a 32% chance of going to jail. Latino males have a 17% chance, and white males have about a 6% chance. Despite the fact that black youth account for about 16% of the juvenile population, they are 28% of juvenile arrests, 37% of youth in jails, and 58% of youth sent to adult prisons. The U.S. leads the world in incarceration, and black men comprise the largest share of prisoners, U.S. prisoners. This is the structural racism that drives the prison industrial complex, and it has been extended outwards from the U.S. It has become a leading strategy for addressing, or better, not addressing, the problems of poverty that have been created and exacerbated by global capitalism. Prisons rely on and benefit from racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia. Prisons help to stabilize binary and simplistic notions of gender. Prisons are especially oppressive to gay, lesbian, transgender people. But perhaps what is most dangerous of all is that prisons are designed to create a false sense of security. They convey the impression that the bad people are behind bars and the good people are those who inhabit the free world. But let me pause for a moment here, because you're probably wondering, well, where does feminism figure into this picture? We're talking about men in prison and so forth. So let me suggest some ways in which feminism figures into this conversation of prisons, the prison industrial complex, abolitionist approaches. On the one hand, there's been a reluctance to view prison issues as playing a major role in women's lives because women constitute a relatively small proportion of the imprisoned population in most places and almost everywhere in the world. However, it should be recognized that during the recent period, women have come to constitute the fastest growing sector of the imprisoned population. And in the US, of course, black women are the fastest growing within that female population. I referred to two prisons earlier, and I said I might very well be in one of them. I mean, it's quite interesting that over the last 20 years, the prison population in California has soared when it comes to women. And California now claims both the first and the second largest women's prisons in the entire world. But even more importantly, looking very specifically at the circumstances surrounding women in prison impels us to consider connections between the public and the private, the political and the personal. And indeed, this can provide more profound insights about the prison system and the prison industrial complex more generally. Women prisoners who have experienced violence and trauma in their intimate lives discover that this violence is reproduced in similar ways by the institution of the prison. Routine strip searching, for example, cavity searching, does not feel very different from rape and sexual assault. As a matter of fact, in Australia, an organization I work with called Sisters Inside conducted a very interesting campaign over a protracted period, and it was called Stop State Sexual Assault. Now, the notion that the state can be a perpetrator of sexual assault is an especially important analysis, given that we assume that perpetrators of sexual assault are always individual, and we do not think about the state as subject, the state as perpetrator in that sense. Abolitionist approaches will have to address both institutional violence and private or privatized violence. And we begin to understand the violence that we usually refer to as violence against women as privatized forms of violence that take place on an institutional scale in institutions like the prison. Moreover, if we approach feminism as a broad framework that allows us to think a range of social categories in terms of their interactions, we're better able to imagine the possible abolition of prisons, rather than assuming that our methods of analysis always require us to segregate, separate, isolate, simplify, thus significantly shrinking the frame within which we produce social understandings. Feminist scholars and activists and cultural producers, and off the top of my head, I could say Audre Lorde, Gloria Anzaldúa, Jackie Alexander, for example, to mention a few. They call for epistemologies that enlarge and amplify and congregate and complicate. And this is what is required in an abolitionist approach. So let me consider the debates around the use of law enforcement and incarceration to address the problem of violence against women. Early on, the anti-violence movement, the women's anti-violence movement in the US, and I know that there was a very powerful anti-violence movement in India. In the US, that movement did not necessarily take into account the different histories of violence among different groups of women. Black women, for example, not only experienced sexual assault as a violation of their own bodies, but they linked these assaults, especially, but not only when committed by white men, with the racist use of the rape charge, which targeted black men. And a number of years ago, I spoke at a conference called The Color of Violence, in which we examined the role of violence in the lives of women of color and the possibilities of building movements against them. And I don't usually like to quote myself, but I say this succinctly here, so I do have quotation marks and a reference here. Okay, so what I said then was that we need an analysis that furthers neither the conservative project of sequestering millions of men of color in accordance with the contemporary dictates of globalized capital and its prison industrial complex, nor the equally conservative project of abandoning poor women of color to a continuum of violence that extends from the sweatshops through the prisons to shelters and into bedrooms at home. How do we develop analyses and organizing strategies against violence against women that acknowledge the race of gender and the gender of race? In 1994, abolitionist and peace activist Faye Honey Knott published an article in the journal Peace Review. It was entitled Radical Feminism and Abolition. And in this article, she explains, at least implicitly, why she shifted her concerns from direct engagements with the institution of the prison. And I should mention that she was one of the pivotal abolitionist leaders in the 1970s and published a handbook called Instead of Prisons, a handbook for abolitionists. And so she shifted her concerns from these direct engagements with the institution of the prison to working with sex offenders. So one might ask, well, what does working with sex offenders have to do with prison abolition? And what is feminist about working with sex offenders? After all, it took decades and perhaps centuries of feminist activism to have violence against women institutionally acknowledged. So what was Knott's linkage between feminist responses to violence and a feminist approach to abolition? As long as the primary response to the crime of rape, for example, is to demand longer, harsher sentences for rapists, we shortchange our ability to address the roots of this behavior. And she said, I'm quoting now, until we as feminists have a coherent, well-articulated, well-considered analysis to counter the war model response to criminal sexual behaviors that are not only parentheses, that are not only socially and culturally learned, but perpetrated by social institutions, we will foster an increasingly caged, punitive, and counterproductive society. And she refers to an editorial printed in that handbook for abolitionists I mentioned, called Instead of Prisons. If all men who had ever raped were incarcerated tomorrow, rape would continue outside as well as inside prisons. Incarceration does not challenge the societal attitudes that promote rape. In a society that deals with symptoms rather than causes of problems, prisons make perfect sense. Confronting the cause of rape would threaten the basic structure of society. Prison is vindictive. It is not concerned with change, but with punishment. And its real social function is similar to that of rape. It acts as a buffer, as an oppressive institution where a few scapegoats pay for the ills of society. Now, about a decade after Faye Honey Knott published her article on radical feminism and abolition, an organization by the name of Insight, Women of Color Against Violence, began to consider how to rethink movements against violence against women. And Insight points out that law enforcement approaches to violence against women may deter some acts of violence in the short term. However, they point out, as an overall strategy for ending violence, criminalization has not worked. In fact, mandatory arrest laws for domestic violence have led to decreases in the number of battered women who killed their partners in self-defense. But they have not led to a decrease in the number of batterers who kill their partners. Thus, they point out, the law protects batterers more than it protects survivors. So how can we begin to reconceptualize the end of violence against women? It forces us to address a whole range of issues, structural issues, socio-psychological issues. How can we eradicate illiteracy, housing, healthcare? How can we address, how can we begin to understand the cycle of violence that has reproduced this pandemic of violence throughout the world? We will also have to reimagine justice. So how can we imagine a trajectory towards justice that is restorative and reparative rather than retributive and vindictive? How can we imagine an approach to justice that is equally concerned about the healing of those who are harmed, and one which will not simply insist on throwing away the perpetrator so we no longer have to think about the problem? So let me conclude by saying that we urgently need alternatives to imprisonment. We need to dismantle the prison industrial complex. People whose economic and social conditions lead them along trajectories that lead directly into prison need better opportunities. And for this, we need societies that are not based on the capitalist notion of profit, but rather on the principle of serving the needs of human beings, of all human beings, women, men, transgender persons, poor people, people of all racial ethnic, national backgrounds, LGBT communities, disabled people, older people. And in this context, I think I should evoke our non-human companions as well, and our environment and all that that entails. I think that I think about what is currently unfolding in North Africa, in the Middle East, and especially in Palestine. When I say, let us join our hands and unite our voices in struggle for a better world. Knopf said, and I really like this passage from her work, the struggle for most of us has never been whether to continue or give up. And I think that those of us who are somewhat older can really appreciate this. But rather, how to lead a life of integrity with the fewest of contradictions in a culture that often devalues, inhibits, negates, or co-opts the principles we support. How to stay rooted in the spiritual while actively pursuing justice, while being oppositional, confrontational, while being outraged, while all the time trying to reduce the pain in pain-filled people in a pain-filled world. Now, oftentimes I tell myself that this may be my only mission, to reduce pain and not to increase it. And so I ask finally, how can